June 18, 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy, France. Obergefreiter Klaus Weber pressed his body against the damp earth of a shallow foxhole, his Mauser rifle forgotten beside him. For the 8th time that morning, he heard the rumble. Not artillery, not tanks, something far more terrifying. Through the gap in the hedgerow, he watched another American supply convoy roll past. 50 trucks, then 70. Then he stopped counting. Each vehicle carried more ammunition than his entire battalion had seen in 3 months. Weber pulled out a scrap of paper and scribbled with trembling hands. "We are shooting at them with bullets. They are burying us with entire factories." His company commander had told them the Americans would run out of supplies within a week of landing. That was 12 days ago. The convoys kept coming. An endless river of steel that never stopped flowing. What Weber witnessed that morning would shatter every assumption the Wehrmacht held about modern warfare. This is the story of how German soldiers discovered they weren't just fighting an army. They were fighting the entire industrial might of a nation that had learned to move mountains across an ocean. The German High Command had convinced itself of a comfortable lie. When Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, German strategists predicted logistical collapse within days. Their reasoning seemed sound. The Allies had no port. Cherbourg remained in German hands. The artificial Mulberry harbors appeared fragile, temporary. German staff officers calculated that without a major deep-water port, the invasion force would starve for supplies. Ammunition would dwindle, fuel would evaporate. The mighty Allied army would wither on the beach like a fish out of water. They were catastrophically wrong. Who faced the Allies in those first weeks after D-Day came from a military tradition built on rapid maneuver and living off conquered land. The Blitzkrieg doctrine that had conquered Poland, France, and nearly defeated the Soviet Union relied on speed and audacity, not supply chains. German soldiers were accustomed to scarcity. They made do with what they had. A battalion received its supplies when headquarters could spare them, often by horse-drawn wagon. This was normal. This was how armies had operated. Then 326,000 Allied troops had landed in Normandy. They brought with them 104,000 tons of supplies and 54,000 vehicles. But this was just the beginning. The American supply system was designed to scale. Each day, more ships arrived. Each day, more supplies flowed across the beaches. The Germans watched in disbelief as a logistical miracle unfolded before their eyes. The artificial Mulberry harbors, which German engineers had dismissed as desperate improvisation, were moving 7,000 tons of cargo per day. The beaches themselves had been transformed into organized chaos, with supplies stacked in massive dumps organized by type, guarded by military police, and distributed with mechanical efficiency. What the German soldiers didn't know was that they were witnessing the culmination of American industrial mobilization. Since 1941, the United States had transformed itself into what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. American factories were producing 1 aircraft every 5 minutes. A ship was launched every day. The production numbers were so staggering that even Allied commanders sometimes struggled to believe them. The 2.5-ton truck, nicknamed the Deuce and a Half, had become the workhorse of American logistics. General Motors, Ford, and other manufacturers were building them at a rate of 50,000 per month. These trucks would become the backbone of what German soldiers would come to fear more than American firepower itself. June 18th was not unusual. It was typical. And that was what made it so terrifying. June 19th, 1944. The village of Saint-Jean-de-Dié. Klaus Weber had not slept in 31 hours. His unit, the 352nd Infantry Division, had been in continuous combat since the landings. They held a position overlooking a main road that the Americans were using as a supply route. Weber had been ordered to observe and report. What he observed defied belief. The convoy began arriving at dawn. Weber wrote in his diary, which would be discovered decades later in a German archive. 05:30 hours. The first trucks appeared. American GMC 2.5-ton models. I counted 40 before I lost track, each one loaded with wooden crates, artillery shells, I assume. The trucks were pristine, new. Their engines hummed like sewing machines. Behind them came fuel tanker, ammunition, and be expected to make them last days. German artillery crews learned to fire sparingly, conserving shells for critical moments. Every drop of fuel was precious. Breakdowns were catastrophic because spare parts were scarce. Polarity: the Americans operated under completely different rules. An American infantry division in Normandy consumed 700 tons of supplies every single day. 700 tons. Daily. For comparison, a German infantry division typically received 40 to 80 tons per day when supplies were good. The mathematics of this disparity were brutal. American soldiers could fire their weapons freely. They could call in artillery support without worrying about shell conservation. If a vehicle broke down, mechanics had spare parts. If those parts weren't immediately available, they could order them. Often, it was simpler to just replace the entire vehicle. Lieutenant Friedrich Hoffmann of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division recorded his observations on June 20th. "We captured an American supply dump yesterday. What we found made our men weep with anger and despair. Crates of ammunition stacked 3 meters high, stretching for 50 meters in every direction. Medical supplies that would have supplied our entire division for 6 months. Rations, cigarettes, coffee, chocolate, and fuel drums, hundreds of fuel drums. We couldn't even carry away a fraction of it before their artillery forced us to withdraw. We destroyed what we could. It felt like trying to drain the ocean with a bucket. 2 hours later, their trucks arrived and began rebuilding the dump as if nothing had happened." The contrast was visible in the soldiers themselves. German troops in Normandy were exhausted. Many had not received proper supplies in weeks. Their uniforms were worn. Their boots were falling apart. They were hungry, not starving, but perpetually hungry in the way that grinds down morale and dulls the mind. They looked at American prisoners and saw men who were well-fed, well-equipped, and carrying personal items that seemed like impossible luxuries. American soldiers had cigarettes. They had candy bars. Some even had personal weapons they'd purchased themselves because they create a dedicated highway system exclusively for supply trucks. Close these roads to all other traffic. Run convoys 24 hours per day, 7 days per week, in a continuous loop from the beaches to the front lines and back. Name it the Red Ball Express, after a railroad term for high-priority freight. The system began with 132 truck companies. Each company had 48 trucks. Each truck would make a round trip of up to 600 miles every 36 hours. The trucks drove with headlights on, even in daylight, to signal their priority status. Military police guarded every intersection. Any vehicle blocking the Red Ball route was moved, by force if necessary. The trucks drove bumper to bumper, maintaining speeds of 25 miles per hour on roads that had never been designed for such traffic. Archrick Mueller commanded a Wehrmacht reconnaissance unit tasked with gathering intelligence on American supply operations. His report, dated June 27, 1944, was classified as urgent for high command eyes only. The report read, "Enemy supply operations exceed all previous estimates. We observed continuous truck convoys on Route N13 for a period of 8 hours. Estimate minimum 400 vehicles per hour. Each vehicle carries approximately 5 tons of cargo. Calculate minimum 16,000 tons per day on this single route. We have identified at least 3 other routes of similar capacity. The Americans are moving more supplies in 1 week than our entire Army group receives in 1 month. Respectfully request higher command reassess strategic situation in light of enemy logistical capabilities. Current defensive strategy predicated on assumption of enemy supply constraints. This assumption is demonstrably false. Report. The report was received, filed, and largely ignored. The German High Command was not prepared to accept what the report implied. Accepting it would mean accepting that the war was already lost. German soldiers in the field had no such illusions. Gefreiter Otto Becker wrote to his brother on July 1st, "You asked about the Americans. Let me tell you what they are like. Yesterday we attacked one of their supply dumps. We needed fuel desperately. Our tanks exhausting jobs in the theater. The drivers operated under constant threat of German air attack, artillery, and ambush. They drove through mud, rain, and darkness. Accidents were common. The roads were not designed for such heavy traffic, and vehicles often slid into ditches or collided in the darkness. Despite these challenges, the Red Ball Express delivered an average of 12,500 tons of supplies every single day. By September 1944, the system had transported over 400,000 tons of critical supplies. Hauptmann Josef Lehmann, a supply officer for the German 7th Army, wrote in his official report, "Enemy logistical advantage is not merely quantitative, it is qualitative. Their system is organized with industrial precision. Every truck knows its route, its cargo, its destination, and its schedule. Their military police control traffic flow. Their maintenance units repair vehicles on the roadside. They have established fuel stations every 50 kilometers. They have field hospitals for injured drivers. They have treated their supply line as a military operation deserving the same planning and resources as any combat operation. By contrast, our supply system relies on improvisation, requisition, and hope. We are attempting 19th century logistics in a 20th century war. The Americans have invented 21st century logistics. We cannot compete." Weber saw the Red Ball Express trucks for the first time on July 3rd. His diary entry was brief. "Watched the trucks today. They have painted red balls on them. They drive all day and all night. The noise never stops. The headlights create a river of light on the horizon after dark. It looks like a city that moves. I have stopped trying to count them. There is no point. Trying to count American trucks is like trying to count stars." The psychological impact was devastating. July 12, 1944. The Battle for Saint-Lô. The Americans were preparing for a major offensive. German intelligence observed the buildup with growing horror. The concentration of supplies was unlike anything they had ever witnessed. Ammunition dumps stretched for kilometers. Fuel storage facilities were established within artillery range of German positions, a sign of either supreme confidence or reckless abandon. And fire sparingly. American gunners learned to saturate target areas with overwhelming firepower. The American philosophy was simple. If you're not sure if the enemy is in a particular location, fire enough shells to ensure nothing survives there anyway. The expenditure was enormous. A single American artillery battalion could fire 10,000 rounds in a single day if the tactical situation demanded it. German quartermasters would have considered such consumption criminally wasteful. American planners considered it operationally necessary. The supplies kept arriving. Weber's unit was repositioned closer to Saint-Lô on July 13th. His new position overlooked an American forward supply point. He wrote, "I can see their supply operations from here. They have trucks arriving every 15 minutes. The trucks are unloaded by teams of soldiers working like factory workers on an assembly line. Crates are moved from trucks to organized piles. Everything is labeled. Everything has a place. They have signs, directional arrows, an officer with a clipboard checking items off a list. It looks like a warehouse operation, except this warehouse is 8 kilometers from the front line and supplied by trucks that drive through active combat zones as if they are making routine deliveries. I watched one truck arrive with a flat tire. The driver was not concerned. A maintenance team arrived within 30 minutes. They did not repair the tire. They replaced the entire wheel. The truck was moving again in 45 minutes. We have trucks in our motor pool that have been waiting 3 weeks for spare parts. The Americans replace a wheel in less than an hour. German soldiers were not merely outgunned. They were outsupplied in ways that affected every aspect of combat. American soldiers had adequate food. This meant they had energy. They had strength. They could march longer, fight harder, and recover faster. American soldiers had sufficient ammunition. This meant they did not hesitate to fire when threatened. They did not conserve rounds. They could afford to miss. German soldiers, calculating every bullet, fought with a caution born of scarcity. American soldiers fought with the confidence of abundance. Felt particularly kind, but because they had so much that even their prisoners ate well. Trembling, the supply disparity created a psychological divide. German soldiers began to see the war not as a contest between two military forces, but as an inevitable defeat by an economic system they could not match. Officers stopped talking about victory and started talking about holding positions as long as possible. The phrase, "as long as possible," became a euphemism for until we run out of ammunition, fuel, and hope. Minimized, but the real shock was yet to come. July 25, 1944, Operation Cobra begins. The Americans launched their breakout offensive with a bombardment that redefined the meaning of overwhelming firepower. More than 1,500 heavy bombers from the U.S. 8th Air Force dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs on German positions in a concentrated area south of Saint-Lô. The bombing lasted for 72 minutes. When it ended, American artillery opened fire. Over 1,000 artillery pieces fired a continuous barrage for another hour. The Germans called it the Devil's Carpet. Unteroffizier Paul Schmidt survived the bombardment. He wrote, "The world ended on July 25th. I do not know how else to describe it. The sound was not sound. It was pressure. It crushed the air from your lungs. The earth moved like ocean waves. Trees vanished. Buildings vanished. Men vanished. I was in a reinforced bunker 6 meters underground. The bunker collapsed. I dug myself out 3 hours later. When I reached the surface, the landscape had changed. Nothing looked the same. What had been a forest was now a field of splinters. What had been a village was now dust. I found 7 men from my company. We had been 142 men that morning. I do not know what happened to the others. I assume they are dead, or buried, or they simply ceased to exist. The Americans did this because they could, because they had the bombs, the planes, the artillery shells, and the will to use them all at once. We had no defense. We had no response. We could only endure it and hope to survive. The bombardment was a demonstration of American logistical power, translated into pure destructive force. The 3,000 tons of bombs dropped that day represented just fuel shortages. Our artillery is silent for lack of shells. Request permission to withdraw to more defensible positions before the entire army is destroyed. Hitler denied the request. The German front collapsed, not because German soldiers stopped fighting, but because they ran out of the resources needed to continue fighting. American tanks advanced, and when they ran low on fuel, supply trucks arrived to refuel them at the front line. German tanks ran out of fuel and were abandoned. American artillery fired thousands of rounds per day. German artillery fired when targets were critical enough to justify the expenditure of scarce shells. American infantry advanced, knowing that ammunition, food, and medical supplies would follow them. German infantry held positions, knowing that no resupply was coming. Obergefreiter Klaus Weber and what remained of his unit began a fighting retreat on July 28th. His diary entries became shorter, more desperate. July 28. Retreating east, no food today. July 29. Americans everywhere. Their tanks, their trucks, their supplies. Endless. July 30. Found abandoned German supply truck. Empty. American supply dump 2 kilometers away. Full. The irony would be funny if it were not killing us. July 31st. Last entry. Out of everything. Out of ammunition, out of food, out of hope. We'll bury this diary and surrender tomorrow. To whoever finds this, we did not lose because we did not fight hard enough. We lost because we were fighting a nation that could move the world. Weber surrendered on August 1, 1944. He survived the war and returned to Germany in 1947. In interviews conducted in the 1970s, he was asked what he remembered most about fighting the Americans in Normandy. His answer was simple. The trucks. Always the trucks. Rivers of trucks. Mountains of supplies. An army that never ran out of anything. We were brave. We were well trained. We were fighting for our homeland. And none of it mattered. Because bravery cannot defeat logistics. Courage cannot overcome supply chains. We learned that the modern war is not won by the bravest soldiers. It is won by the nation that can deliver the most. Convoys ran in both directions continuously. Trucks heading to the front carried ammunition, fuel, and food. Trucks returning carried wounded soldiers, German prisoners, and empty containers to be refilled. The system was so efficient that American units sometimes complained about having too many supplies. Dumps were established and then abandoned as the advance outpaced the ability to use everything that was being delivered. German units retreating through France faced the opposite problem. They were outrunning their own supply lines, which were collapsing. German logistics relied on railroads, and the French rail system had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. Horse-drawn transport was too slow. German trucks were breaking down and could not be repaired for lack of spare parts. Fuel shortages meant that perfectly functional vehicles had to be abandoned. German units dissolved not in combat, but during retreat, as soldiers scattered to find food and transportation. Hauptmann Karl Bauer was a logistics officer in the German 5th Panzer Army. He was captured during the retreat from Paris. In a post-war interview, he described the final days. By mid-August, I knew the war was over. Not because of battlefield defeats, because the numbers made victory impossible. We could not move supplies forward. The Americans were moving supplies faster than their combat units could consume them. I saw American dumps with supplies stacked in the open, unguarded, because they had more supplies than storage space. Meanwhile, we were rationing rifle ammunition. I was a logistics officer. I understood what these numbers meant. Logistics is mathematics. The mathematics were clear. We had lost. Everything that happened after August 1944 was just prolonging the inevitable. The contrast between American and German logistics was most visible during the liberation of Paris. American units entered the city on August 25th with a parade of vehicles that seemed endless. Tanks, trucks, jeeps, ambulances, artillery pieces, supply vehicles, command cars, and motorcycles. All of them moving, all of them supplied, all of them representing the industrial power of a nation that had learned to project force across an ocean and sustain it indefinitely. French civilians who witnessed the American entry into Paris were struck by the abundance. France had been occupied for 4 years. The German occupation had meant scarcity. Disciplined, very organized, but you could see they were constrained, controlled. Everything was rationed, everything was measured. When the Americans arrived in 1944, it was different. They seemed relaxed, confident. They had supplies piled on their vehicles. They were giving things away: chocolate, cigarettes, chewing gum. The children went crazy. We had not seen chocolate in 4 years. The Americans were tossing it like confetti. I realized that we had been liberated not just by soldiers, but by wealth, by a nation so rich that even its army could afford to be generous. September 1944. The supply lines stretch. The rapid Allied advance created a new problem. The supply lines from Normandy to the advancing front were now stretching over 400 kilometers. The Red Ball Express was operating beyond its designed capacity. Trucks were breaking down from continuous use. Drivers were exhausted. The system was straining under the demand. For the first time since D-Day, American commanders faced actual supply constraints. The solution was to capture a deep-water port. Antwerp, Belgium was captured in early September, but could not be used until the Scheldt estuary was cleared of German forces. This took 2 months. In the meantime, everything still had to come across the beaches or through smaller ports. The Red Ball Express continued operating at maximum capacity. By the time it was officially discontinued in November 1944, the Express had transported over 400,000 tons of supplies and had driven a cumulative distance equivalent to circling the Earth 150 times. German forces, now falling back toward their own borders, experienced a brief improvement in supply as their lines shortened and they retreated toward their own remaining logistics infrastructure. But the fundamental disparity remained. American factories continued producing at wartime capacity. German production was declining under sustained Allied bombing. The gap was widening, not closing. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzerlehr Division, assessed the situation in September 1944. "We are fighting with one hand tied behind our back." No, that is not accurate. We are fighting with both hands. 3,000. These numbers represented not just industrial capacity, but logistical capability. Every truck manufactured meant more supplies delivered. Every aircraft meant more bombs dropped and more air superiority. Every tank meant more breakthrough capability. The production gap was a force multiplier that affected every aspect of the war. The German soldiers who had survived Normandy and witnessed American logistics understood that they were not fighting a fair fight. They were fighting an industrial superpower that had mobilized its entire economy for war. Gefreiter Otto Becker, who had survived the retreat from Normandy, wrote in October 1944, "People ask me what the Americans are like. Are they good soldiers? Are they brave? Do they fight well? These questions miss the point. The Americans are adequately trained and reasonably brave, but that is not why they are winning. They are winning because behind every American soldier is a factory. Behind every American tank is a steel mill. Behind every American aircraft is an aluminum plant. They are not better warriors. They are better organized. They have transformed their entire nation into a war machine. We are fighting against America, all of America. Every factory, every farm, every mine. How do you defeat that? You cannot. Not with courage, not with training, not with tactics. You can only hope to survive it." The logistical superiority demonstrated in Normandy became the template for American military operations for the remainder of the war and beyond. The lessons learned in those summer months of 1944 shaped modern military doctrine. The United States military became the most mobile, most supplied, and most logistically sophisticated force in history. For the German soldiers who faced this system, the experience was transformative. They had entered the war believing in the superiority of German training, German tactics, and German leadership. They left the war understanding that industrial capacity and logistical competence had become the decisive factors in modern warfare. Bravery mattered, skill mattered, but supply chains mattered more. Klaus Weber survived the war. He returned to his home near Munich in 1947, one of millions of German soldiers who came home to a destroyed nation. In the decades where logistics was not an afterthought, but the central pillar of their entire military strategy, we were still thinking about warfare the way armies had fought for centuries: move fast, strike hard, live off the land. The Americans had invented a new way of war. They moved entire factories to the battlefield. They fed their soldiers like factory workers because they understood that fed soldiers fight better. They gave their commanders unlimited ammunition because they knew that firepower saves lives. They built roads, established supply points, organized transport networks, and treated logistics like a science. We treated logistics like something you dealt with when you had time. We lost because we were fighting a 20th century war with 19th century logistics. The Americans were already fighting 21st century war. We never caught up. The historian asked a follow-up place. We had said. The historian asked a follow-up place. We never close to the truth of literally war. We never caught up without the late of a life. We never caught up. With way to the war, on we find thought at it. We have at the late of a life, then 7, we could developed to a vision. We never caught up. We start, then everything. The historian asked a follow-up place. We never close to the truth of literally war. We not the late of a life when they fist first west. We really live this time things like wave them. We find all a more tact with people who is very, very comfortable, an end of the places for bothers on the ultimate conference that willed this. The mother was just aware of content and would. We realized from him ejected with might lift. We lived it as well. With 1.1 for 201 with good with white lift. We want it. And want. We run as the gwid is well in other evening to independent. The mother we need that the literally want, when his represented silver has been bided and actively. We present him that the literally want anyway, the closes of confrontation is only father literally for everyone, which was stage into the literally will come to the new of what lift. We divdid another plan oners to one and other on life. We present him that literally want was discovered from the rail of independent. The womer is not in myself. The saved in heverbeen as a big word was abstily. We considerately in a much problem for a cant information we'll literally want as well. The place represented silver all the vidival different thoughts. On the school point, we'll lend in what lift. We present him, they treated logistics like a science. We treated logistics like something you dealt with when you had time. We historian asked a follow-up question. When did you know Germany would lose the war? Weber paused. Then he said, June 18, 1944. The morning I counted the 8th American convoy. I knew in that moment. Not because of any single thing I saw, but because I understood what I was seeing. Those trucks represented a nation that had mobilized completely, a nation that could build. The most memorable aspect was not the combat, but the supplies, the endless trucks, the inexhaustible dumps, the realization that they were facing not just an army, but an entire nation's industrial might delivered to the battlefield with mechanical efficiency. Friedrich Hoffmann, the SS officer who had observed American supply operations in June 1944, survived the war and immigrated to Argentina in 1949. He lived quietly until his death in 1987. In his personal papers, discovered after his death, was a letter he had written to his son but never sent. The letter, dated 1975, included this passage. "You were born after the war. You grew up in peace. You have never known hunger or fear or defeat. This is good. I am glad you were spared what I experienced. But I want you to understand something about that war. We did not lose because we were cowards. We did not lose because we did not fight hard enough. We lost because we were fighting against a machine. The Americans had built a system for winning wars. They had calculated how many bullets, how many shells, how many tons of fuel were needed to defeat an enemy. Then they built factories to produce those amounts. Then they built ships to transport them. Then they built trucks to distribute them. Then they organized all of it with the efficiency of a factory assembly line. They approached war like an industrial problem, and they solved it. We approached war like warriors, brave, skilled, dedicated warriors. But warriors cannot defeat industries. That is the lesson. Remember it. The world belongs to those who can organize resources, not just to those who can fight. Affirmative. The contrast between German and American logistics in Normandy was not just a military factor. It was a civilizational difference. The United States had become the first nation to fully industrialize warfare, to treat military supply as a problem of industrial engineering rather than traditional military planning. This transformation represented a fundamental shift in how wars would be fought in the modern era. Today, military historians study the Normandy campaign as a masterclass in logistics. The Red Ball Express, where he first witnessed the American convoys, is now one of the most quoted German soldier accounts from World War II. His words captured what thousands of German soldiers experienced but few could articulate: the realization that they were not fighting an army, but fighting against the organized industrial output of the world's most productive economy. The trucks kept rolling. The supplies kept arriving. The war continued. But on June 18, 1944, in a foxhole in Normandy, a German soldier named Klaus Weber counted his 8th convoy of the morning and knew that the war was already over. The shooting would continue for another year. The dying would continue, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Americans had brought their factories to Europe, and no army in history had ever defeated an industrial revolution. If you found this story fascinating, there are hundreds more untold stories from World War II waiting to be discovered. Subscribe to ensure you never miss these remarkable accounts of courage, sacrifice, and transformation.